Welcome back to Your Name Shall Be Great, the Abraham narrative with Rabbi David Silber. We are continuing with chapter 19 of Bereshit. And otherwise, Rabbi Silber, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Okay, so we're up to chapter 19. Chapter 19 is the story of Lot and the story of Sodom. It has a particular relevance to this time of year because it's deeply related to the story of the Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim, as we will touch upon for sure. But it's part of the larger Avram narrative. And the stories of Avram in general, the narrative has doubled stories. So we encountered Lot back in chapter 12 and chapter 13. Chapter 12 is where he leaves together with Avram, Vayelech ito Lot, beginning of chapter 12. Chapter 13 is where Avram and Lot separate. Avram says we should separate. There's been a quarrel between the shepherds. You go to the north, I'll go to the south. You go to the south, I'll go to the north. In the language of the Torah, Yaminu Small, which is north and south. But Lot doesn't go north or south. He picks up his eyes in chapter 13. He sees the plain of the Jordan, which is very fertile. And Vayisalot Mikedem, he travels east. Mikedem does not mean from the east in that context. It means to the east. He travels eastward. And in general, in Sefer Bereshit, when you go east, you go out of the sacred place, starting with the story of the Garden of Eden, east of Eden. So that's where we find Lot. And actually now, earlier Avram had prayed for Sodom. We know that Lot has chosen by Vayehal ad Sodom in chapter 13. He pitched his tent up to Sodom. Avram in the previous chapter, we saw this last week, prays for Sodom. Maybe they're 50 righteous, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Maybe we'll come back to his prayer today, maybe not. But in any event, now we get to chapter 19. This is the second iteration of the second piece of the Lot story and Lot's place in the Abraham narrative and beyond. So let's begin right away with chapter 19. There's a lot to talk about in chapter 19. It says, "Vayavo shnei hamalachim Sodom ba'erev, Lot yoshev b'shar Sodom." So these two messengers of God, two of them. What happened to the third? There were three who visited Abraham, and now there are two. So let's leave that question aside for now. That's a very interesting question, not for right now. In any event, two of these messengers, we might call them angels, arrive into Sodom, and they come at night, and we find Lot, the main player in chapter 19, Yoshev B'shar Sodom. He's sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, often when you sit in the gate, a gate is a public space. A gate is sometimes a not just public space, but perhaps it's also seen as a central public space. We have it, for example, in the poem Eshet Chayo, Noda Basharim Bala, B'shivto and Ziknei Aretz. So her husband is known in the Shar, sits with the elders in the Shar. And we also have this in the 4th chapter of the book of Ruth, who Boaz Allah Hashar Vayeshev Sham. Boaz went to the gate, sat down, and he went to the elders. He told them to sit down. You sit down, and they're going to have a case. Case will be about Ruth's land, the marriage of Ruth, etc. So it's a public hearing, and it takes place Bashar. So Lot we find not just in Sodom, but he's Bashar Sodom. Some of the Medrash claims maybe he's actually was appointed as a judge, this and that, but in any event, he's in the public space and he's in Sodom, which is important. Vayar Lot, Lot sees them. He rushes to greet them. So he bows down to these two people. Vayomer hinena Adonai suruna al beit avdechem v'linu v'rachatu raglechem v'ishkamtem v'alachtem l'darkechem. So he says to them, suruna, turn aside to the house of your servant. He calls himself their servant. And he and you rest here, wash your feet, and in the morning you will depart. But they say no, we'd rather stay, we'd rather sleep or a rechov. A rechov is a public place, a street. The word rechov is related to the word rachav, which is Broadway, exactly the point. Broadway is rechov. So they prefer not to enter his house. They prefer to stay in the street. The Torah doesn't tell us why they prefer to stay in the street. The Medrash and Rashi follows that. Rashi's pretty down on Lot altogether. With Abraham, they gladly accepted his offer of hospitality, but with Lot, they initially refused. Of course, there could be other reasons why they refused. I can think of two reasons why they might refuse. Number one, here they're being sent to judge the town. So perhaps the thinking is the best place to judge the town would be to remain only in the public space, not to go to any particular person's house. That's one possibility. Another possibility could be that knowing Sodom, and they know something about Sodom, we know they're bad. We don't necessarily know how bad, but they clearly know good. As the Torah said earlier, and as the previous chapter, God says to Abraham, Zakat Sodom v'Amorah ki rabba v'chatatam ki kavda ma'od. The sin is grievous. How grievous? I don't know. We'll check it out. So perhaps going into Lot's house, perhaps they think or know that might put him in danger. And given the fact that hospitality is a barometer of how good a person is, as we saw in the previous chapter. So perhaps that's the reason that they initially refused. Be that as it may, what we notice is that Lot does offer hospitality, and no one else is offering hospitality in the narrative. He's the one who rushes out there. It's very Abraham-like. There may be distinctions between the way Lot speaks to them, what Lot offers. Abraham offers them a sumptuous meal, and Lot in the next verse, in Pasuk Gimel, he insists. He's very persuasive or very insisting, and he urges them to come very strongly. He makes a feast for them, a mishteh. Mishteh usually is a meal where you drink, and we know that, for example, drinking at a meal typically signifies that the meal is a special meal. The best example would be Kiddush, actually. The Shabbat meal begins with drink, with Kiddush. And we know that in general, when you go to an important event, often there are drinks before the meal. There's something before the meal. So he gives a mishteh, and he bakes matzah for them, and they ate. So here we have a contrast between the matzah of Lot in verse number 3 and the pat lechem that Avram offers together with the ben habakar and together with the lushi vasi ugot, the cakes that are baked by Sarah. So there is a difference between the two. On the other hand, to talk in terms of Lot's favor, in the case of Abraham, you have willing guests passing by. In the case of Lot, he has to insist. They initially refuse. And Vayiftzar ba'ma'od, he said, very insistent, please come to my house. In any event, they come into the house. He makes a meal for them, a mishteh, not just a meal, but a mishteh. Umatzot afa vayochelu, and Rashi has this well-known comment on umatzot afa vayochelu. He baked matzah, and they ate it. Says Rashi, Pesach haya. It was Pesach. And that's a very interesting comment. On its face, it makes zero sense. What in the world could it mean it was Pesach? There was no Pesach, as you see at Mitzrayim. So we'll have to bear that in mind. But the first point is, as far as Lot is concerned, the Torah presents Lot in these 3 verses, one might say, as being a true son, relative of Abraham, in the sense that he is one who engages in hospitality. Even though he's in the city of Sodom, they have a terrible reputation, but that's Lot. Okay, so it's very positive so far. Terem Yishkavu, before they had not yet gone to sleep, lay down. V'anshei ha'ir anshei Sodom nasabu al habayit nar v'yad zokein kol ha'am mikotzeh. So we are told that the entire town, people of Sodom, surrounded the house. Nasabu al habayit. Nasabu has a pejorative sense over here. They surrounded the house from young to old. All the people, kol ha'am mikotzeh, all the people, down to the last person, gather around the house. Remember that Avram had prayed for Sodom, and Avram had said, listen, you can't destroy the whole city. Maybe there are 50 righteous people. Maybe they're 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And over here we're told that the people of the town, all of them, young to old, so the Kol Ha'am Mikotzeh is intended to be a response, one might say, to Avram's prayers. Maybe there are X number of righteous people. But the whole town is surrounding the house. Vayikru el Lot vayomru lo. They cried out to Lot. Where are those people who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us. Here they translate in the JPS, we would be intimate with them and have you have the same translation. JPS, intimate is not the word I would use over here. That's about intimacy. So in Neda Otam, it probably does have a sexual meaning. But you have elsewhere in the Tanakh, by Yoda Otam, you have it with Gidon, when he comes back and attacks the people of Sukkot and Peniah who didn't support him. So it involves harming. Bring them out to us that it may be sexually, kind of rape, but it's B'nei Otam, it's certainly a negative word. And actually here, it is clear that the Chumash, well, it always chooses its words very carefully. But remember what God had said to Abraham. I'm hearing the cries of Sodom and Amorah. Zakat Sodom v'Amorah kiraba, chatatam kavda ma'od. Let me go down and see. Is what I'm hearing accurate? If so, kala, will utterly destroy them. V'im lo, but if not, eida'ah, I will know. That is to say, I will know what to do. So here the Chumash once again plays with Avram's prayer and God's response. The Neda Otam is clearly a negative, to put it mildly, and it's the whole town. So we already have our response to Abraham. They're on 50, they're on 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Maybe there's one, and I say maybe. In any event, now we have Lot's response. So Lot goes out to them by the entrance to the house, by the petach, by the door. He shuts the door behind him. He wants to make sure they don't get into the house. He doesn't want them rushing into the house. He shuts the door. The door is locked, presumably. He walks out in front of the door. And he says, Vayomar, he says to them, Al no achai toreo, my brethren, achai, literally my brothers. Here they translate my friends, but it's stronger than that. Brothers, al toreo, do not do evil. Don't do evil. Don't do something bad. Hineno v'shtei banot. Behold, I have two daughters, asher lo yadu ish, who have not known the man. Otziano eten aleichem, v'asu lahem katol b'yeinechem. I'll send them out to you. Do whatever you want to them. Rak la'anoshim ha'el al tasu davar, but to these people, don't do anything. Ki al kein bo b'tzel korati, since they have come under the shelter of my roof. So, if we ask ourselves the question, what is wrong with this picture? I don't think it's a hard question to answer, but I would say that, after all, I would say the daughters are also under the shelter of his roof, certainly. And the idea of offering his daughters to the crowd of Sodom, do whatever you want to them, clearly is perverse. There's actually something else here that's important about what he says, and very instructive. And that is, on one hand, his point is that the people who have come into my house, if you enter into my house, it's with the assumption I'm going to protect you. The house provides a kind of sanctuary. You can't touch these people. I brought them into my home with the implicit idea that I'm going to care for you. Now, of course, supposed to care for his daughters as well. But that's a separate story. But the point over here, in addition, is that if Lot wants to be a hero and wants to protect the two guests in his home, so what he could have said was, okay, take me. Don't take them, take me. Or he could have tried to resist. But he doesn't say take me. He says take my daughters. So what we have over here is, apart from everything else, which is highly problematic, we have somebody who doesn't know what it means to take responsibility. Because take responsibility does not mean take my children. Taking responsibility means taking myself. And actually, we have a precise parallel in the book of Bereshit to Lot's response to the crowd. We have exactly the same story later on in this book.
Reuven?
Excuse
Is
me?
it Reuven?
Yes, exactly. The story of Reuven later on, when they come back from Mitzrayim, minus one son, minus Shimon. And Yaakov's very upset with Shimon. They come back with a lot of money too. So Reuven says to his father, Shnei bonai tamit and lo avienu elech. At the end of chapter 43, I believe it is, Reuven says, listen, father, you can kill my two sons if I don't bring him back. Let's find that pasuk. It's the end of chapter 42, actually. Verse number 37. You can kill my two sons. And Yaakov doesn't even respond, says, forget about it. After all, why would Yaakov want to kill his two grandchildren? And then Yehuda speaks up in the beginning of the next chapter, Anochi Erevenu, I take responsibility. If I don't bring him back, I can be held guilty or accountable all of my days. So here you have the case of Lot. Apart from everything else, you have a failure to accept responsibility. We'll come back to that later on. It's very central to this, to Lot in general and to the chapter. But before we get to that, or return to that, there's something else interesting about the story here. First of all, why does Lot offer his two daughters? What is the point of that? So my brother once suggested to me, and I liked it, and I'll repeat it in his name, that actually, and I think we can find this in the Mefarshim as well. I came across this, and I don't remember where. Within the Mefarshim say something similar, which is Lot has taken into his house these two strangers. Apparently, the town knows about this. So the fear of the town, perhaps, is that by Lot bringing two strangers into his house, he's attempting to connect to two people from the outside world, two people not from Sodom, not members of the town. And they might even be thinking, maybe he wants to incorporate them into his family. After all, he has two unmarried daughters. So the concern over here is not just that Lot's being a nice guy, but he might be reaching out to others outside their immediate province. And therefore, he offers his daughters. Look, he says, I'm not interested in these two fellows, And my daughters are not, I'm not making them part of my family. Take my two daughters. You can do whatever you want to them as a demonstration that he has no particular interest beyond just being a nice person with helping these two people from the outside. He has no intent to connect the people from the outside. And here, it's a good segue into a very important point about the story of Sodom in general and the story of Lot. The story of Lot, if we ask ourselves the question, what is the literary function of Lot within the biblical text? What literary function does Lot play? And there are two answers to that, two good answers to that question. Maybe there are more. I can think of two. The first is Lot serves as an important foil to Abraham. He's similar to Abraham in many respects, and yet there are differences between them. And that's point number one. So he casts an important light on our main character, which is Abraham, of course. But apart from that, there's something else about the story of Lot, which Rashi already hints at in that two words of Rashi in the beginning of the chapter, and that is Pesach Haya. The story of Lot in Sodom is similar, and in many respects precisely parallel to the story of Israel in the land of Egypt. So let me just make a few observations about this parallel. in my Haggadah that I wrote 10 years ago with Rachel first, there's a chapter about this in that Haggadah, about the parallels of Lot. And clearly, I mean, I'm sure since then I've thought about many other things. The problem with writing that it gets written down as if it's final, but we know from our learning together, it's never final. You always go back and re-examine it. But let's just pause for a moment to think about this parallel of Lot and Sodom and Israel and Egypt. And the first point, before we get to Lot, let's talk about Sodom. So we remember from chapter 13, when Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the plain of the Jordan, Kikulam Mashke, back in chapter 13, then the Torah added, Lifnei Shachet Hashem et Sodom v'et Amorah. This was before God had destroyed Sodom and Amorah. This is chapter 13, verse number 10. Before God destroyed Sodom and Amorah, Kigan Hashem ki Eretz Mitzrayim. It was like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt, as one all the way to Tzoar, Boach HaTzoar. Gan Hashem ki Eretz Mitzrayim. So the Torah has compared Sodom back in chapter 13. Let's leave the garden of God out of it for now. But ki Eretz Mitzrayim, Eretz Mitzrayim. And so the Torah already drops a hint to us. When you think of Sodom, think about Mitzrayim. And we know that when you read last week's chapter 18, and the Torah said that God says that the cries, Sakat Sodom v'Amorah ki Rabba, the cries from Sodom and Amorah are very great, right? Let me go down and see, says God. Let me check it out. If it's true, if what I'm hearing is accurate, is an accurate description of what's going on there, then I'll destroy them. If not, I'll know. And that phrase, the cries descending to God, is very reminiscent of a pasuk that we have in the beginning of the book of Exodus, in the second chapter of Sefer Shemot, chapter 2. And there the Torah says, the end of chapter 2, says that Vahi Bayamim Harabim Ahem in chapter 2, verse 23, Vayamat Melech Mitzrayim, the king of Egypt, died. Vayayanchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoda vayizaku. Then Israel sighed of the labor. There was a respite, so they groaned or sighed from the avodah, from the slavery. Vayizaku, and they cried out. Vatal shavatam Elohim min ha'avodah, and the cries ascended to God from the slavery. Vayishma Elohim et nakatam, and God heard the cries, and God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayar Elohim, and God saw. Vayeda, and God knew. So here we have exactly in this little section, the end of chapter 2 of Exodus, a very quite precise parallel to Sodom. The cries are ascending to God. God is hearing, but in this case, God sees, and also God knows. All the language of Sodom, right? Erdana v'yareh, v'yimlo eda'a, and the cries ascending to heaven. So there we have a parallel between Sodom and Mitzrayim. But thinking about it more deeply, there are two other parallels that come to mind in terms of describing Sodom. The first one is that Mitzrayim is a place that dislikes the stranger. That's how the Chumash describes it. And that's how the Chumash describes in the beginning of the book of Shemot what Paro says to his people. It says the people are Ravi Yotzu Mimenu, the beginning of the book of Exodus. It's a very perfect shia for Pesach in 3 weeks. So the people are Am B'nai Yisrael Ravi Yotzu Mimenu. We have to outsmart them. Why? Pen your bear, lest they continue to grow, to multiply. Vayati ki tikrena milchama v'nosaf gam hu al sonenu. If a war will come, they will join up with our enemy. V'nilcham banu v'yagam min haaretz, they will rise from the earth. In other words, the concern, what Paro says to his people is that the Israelites in Egypt are a kind of potential fifth column. They'll join up with the enemy, and if a war breaks out, they'll be on the other side against us. So it's concerned about the stranger as someone who's dangerous. And that clearly is what we have in our chapter on Sodom, if the reading is correct. anybody from the outside is a potential danger. And the case of Lot, if what my brother suggested is correct, and I think it is correct, then that's exactly the point. It's not just two people visiting, but he has two unmarried daughters also. He intends to link up with the outsider. I would add to this, by the way, without a discussion for now, that I believe that Yosef himself, the story of Yosef, which is the last quarter or so of this book, that's one of the issues when the brothers come down to Mitzrayim and Yosef has them stay near him in the land of Goshen. That's when things between Joseph and Pharaoh begin to become very, very strained and difficult, and ultimately very, very challenging, and lead to slavery. The brothers coming down to Mitzrayim is very problematic. We'll have to wait for some future date. In any event, that's one parallel between Sodom and Mitzrayim, the way you see the outsider, the stranger. So Hachanasat Orchim from this perspective, is very significant. The way you treat the outside, you welcome the outsider in, as Avram did, as Lot did at the beginning, or not, is very important. That's, I think, obvious point. And now here's a second point that's less obvious. And that is that in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says a new Pharaoh emerged. Vayakom melech hadash Mitzrayim, asher lo yadat Yosef. Didn't know Joseph. Of course, all the commentaries ask the question, and all of us ask the question, what does it mean to say he didn't know Joseph? How could any Pharaoh not know Joseph? Joseph was the one responsible, not just for saving Egypt, but for empowering Paro. It's Joseph who figures out a way to give Paro all the money, all the cattle, and all the land. What in the world could it possibly mean that the hero of Egypt in the book of Breshit, in the first few verses of the next book, that the new Pharaoh emerged who did not know? Did not know means that doesn't want to know. It's conscious forgetting. And he turns against Joseph's people. In the words of the Torah in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, v'nosaf gamhu al sonenu. They will add themselves on to our enemies. V'nosaf. V'nosaf is a play on Joseph. So that's we would say a lack of gratitude, lack of hakarat hatov. Now we have chapter 19. The people of Sodom are about to turn against Lot. They're about to threaten Lot. Who is Lot vis-a-vis the people in Sodom? Lot is Bishar Sodom in chapter 19, verse number 1. But we have to remember something about chapter 19. The story of Lot is the second iteration of the Lot story. The earlier story of Lot, about traveling to Sodom in chapter 13, and in chapter 14, there's a war of 5 kings against 4. The 5 kings include the king of Sodom and Amorah. And the entire town of Sodom is captured by the 4 kings, and all the property is taken, and all the people are taken. And one person saves the town of Sodom, which is Abraham. And he saves the town of Sodom for one reason, and one reason only, because he wants to save Lot. In effect, the very existence of Sodom is due to one person, the person we encounter in chapter 19, verse number 1. Lot Yoshev B'Shar Sodom. So turning against the Lot of all people is the ultimate ingratitude. This is the man who saved everybody's existence was contingent on Lot, and this is the person that the people of the town are about to threaten. That's another Mitzrayim connection. In short, Sodom equals Mitzrayim for our purposes. It's not the same geographical place. That's irrelevant for us. It is the same conceptual place. Now, in point of fact, this is a very important point about the Haggadah, which I will simply mention now, and not get into at this point. And that is that the Haggadah, actually, as we have it, has a section where we have drashot. We engage in midrash, and we are doresh, the parsha that appears at the end of the Torah when you bring your first fruits to the temple. The Torah says when you bring the first fruits to the temple, you have a recitation. It begins with the words Arami Oved Avi, and the Mishnah instructs us in the last chapter of Psachim. Those doing the Daf Yomi, it's right around the corner, and it says B'Doresh Kol HaParsha Kul. You read the parsha of Mikra Bikurim, V'dorish kol parsha kula, and you engage in medrash on the parsha. The Mishnah doesn't tell us what kind of medrash you do. Sounds like everybody does their own medrash. But the Haggadah, the one who's set up the Haggadah for us, this anonymous person who created probably the most read Jewish book, maybe the Bible is first, I'm not sure about that, whether the Bible or the Haggadah. In any event, this anonymous author provided us with various drushot. The first of which begins with the word Tseu Lamad. It's the name of my Haggadah, Tseu Lamad. Go and learn what Lavan, the Aramean, attempted to do to Jacob, our father. Pharaoh only decreed against the boys to throw them into the Nile. Lavan bikesh la'akoret hakol, but Lavan would have uprooted everybody. Shenemar Arami Oved Avi, as it is written, Arami Oved Avi, which the Medrash interprets, the Aramean tried to destroy my father. Probably not the most plausible reading of the verse. It probably means my father was a wandering Aramean. But the Medrash reads it, the Aramean tried to destroy my father. That's the first drush that we have that the Haggadah provides us with. And it's a very strange one, to put it mildly, for Passover night. We're remembering the Exodus from Egypt, and the first thing we say is, you think Pharaoh was bad? Lavan was much worse. Without getting into all the details of that, but the point of that medrash, of the drush, which is the pshat in a certain way, is to make the following observation: that when you study the story of Jacob in the house of Laban, and you study the story of Israel in the land of Egypt, you realize something about the two stories. They're virtually identical. There is some distinction between them, but it fundamentally is the same story. Jacob descending Yaakov mi Beersheva, Vayelech Harana, in chapter 28, Jacob leaving Beersheva and going to Haran in chapter 28, and Jacob leaving Beersheva in chapter 46 and going to Egypt. Those two stories are parallel stories. In other words, what the Haggadah is saying, in effect, is that in thinking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Haggadah tells us, don't think about Egypt. You can think about that particular story, but it's not actually about a historical event of leaving Egypt, of which the Haggadah could care less. It's about what does it mean to leave these kinds of places, whether it's Mitzrayim, whether it's the house of Lavan, whether it is Sodom, whether it's Abraham in our chapter 12 leaving Egypt. And I would add to this, and most interesting of all in my view, is also can be within the land of Israel. In fact, it can even be inside the temple itself. You can be in the temple itself and be in Mitzrayim. And that's the story, of course, in the beginning of the book of Shmuel. Shmuel is resting, he said, Behechal Hashem asher sham Aron Elohim. He is sleeping in the temple in which there is the Ark of God. Maybe even he's sleeping next to the Ark of God in the Holy of Holies, who knows? Behechal Hashem. And then we have the story of the burning bush right there. So it's not about geography. It's a conceptual understanding of what it means to be in dark spaces, in places of limitation, absence of freedom, etc., etc. So that's what the Haggadah points us in that direction. So that's what Rashi's getting at over here when Rashi said Pesach Haya. Rashi doesn't mean literally it's Pesach. Who cares if it's the 15th of Nisan or the 14th of Nisan? But the story, says Rashi, is similar to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I'll make one more comment and I will stop and take comments or questions. And there's something else very interesting about the parallel. Over here, Lot takes these two people into his house. People, angels, whatever, thinks they're people. In any event, and the townspeople say, where are these people? Bring them out to us. V'neida otam, right? To sodomize them. That's the term. So the point is, it's not consensual over here. And Lot offers his daughters, right? And the response in verse number 9, Vayomu Geshala. But the people of the town say Geshala. They translate stand back, stand there, stand away. Vayomru, they said, Harachad balagur vayishbot shafot. this guy comes to dwell amongst us. Lot is a ger. He's a stranger amongst us. He's not a full card-carrying member. He came from the outside. And look at this. Vayishpot shafot. He intends to judge us. Remember that in the previous chapter, Avram had prayed to God for mishpat. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. God, you're the creator of all. You're the judge of the whole world. Will you not do justice? Right? And God said about Avram, I can't conceal from Avram what I plan to do, because I know he teaches everybody to do tzedakah or mishpat. And over here we have a town. Okay, let me go down and check it out. And what do we see about this town? A rejection of mishpat, an utter rejection of mishpat. This guy comes from the outside. Vayishpot shafot. He's going to judge us. Atah now, norah l'chamehem, will be worse for you than to them. Lord had said, don't do evil, don't harm these people. And they're saying, evil, we're going to do plenty of evil, but not for that, against them. Against you who dares to judge us. And they pressed upon Lot very strongly, just as Lot had brought in the strangers in verse number 3. And they're came to break, they're going to break down the door and get at Lot. But the people, who were not just people, but God's messengers, they stretched out their hand, they brought Lot into the house, and they shut the door. Apparently the door had been left open. He didn't lock it behind him, it was open. They bring him into the house, they lock the door. And those who were standing by the door, the opening to the house, Hikuba sanverim, they smote them with blindness. So it's a strange word, sanverim. Probably related to the word iver, which is blind. Mikaton v'yad gadol, from young to old. Vayilulim so hapatach, they were unable, helpless, to find the door, the entrance to the house. Now, this is a very interesting story, and make one observation about the story over here. And when I say it, it's going to be obvious to everybody, but I'll say it anyway. And that is, what we have over here is precisely parallel to a central feature of the story of the Exodus. One might say this central feature of the story of the Exodus. Because we know that the people in Israel, God is going to take them out of Egypt. But we cannot leave Egypt in the story of the Exodus until we first bring the Paschal sacrifice, until we serve God together. And the Paschal sacrifice is the necessary prerequisite to leaving Mitzrayim. And the Paschal sacrifice is brought in the land of Egypt. It's not brought outside the land. It's not a 3-day journey outside. Moshe had requested a journey outside, but the Paschal sacrifice is brought B'Eretz Mitzrayim, inside. So within the land of Egypt, there are, one might say, safe spaces. And the space in the land of Egypt is everybody's bayit. Selah beit avot, selah bayit. It is brought, says the Torah, by members of the house, beit avot, selah bayit, but it's brought for the house. And the Torah does not mean simply that it's brought by members of the house. It's actually brought on the house. The house itself becomes the altar. The blood is smeared on the doorpost and on the lintel of the house. And not only that, we are commanded, and nobody is allowed to leave the house. So the house is set off, one might say, as a sacred space. The house becomes not just a safe place, not just a sanctuary, but the house becomes a kind of altar. What saves us in Mitzrayim as the avenging or destroying angel is found in all of Egypt. What saves us is two things. First of all, the house, because I will not permit the mashchi to enter the house, but it's the blood, the destroying, avenging angel will see the blood on the doorpost. My understanding of that is not just see it's a Jewish house, it's got a mezuzah or something. But the sacrifice itself is instead of the person. The idea of sacrifice is the act of substitution. So I will smite those that don't have the sacrificial offering, they're going to be destroyed. The firstborn, the house is in danger, but those that have brought the sacrifice on the house, that house becomes a safe space. So that's precisely parallel to what we have over here. actually parallel in spades, because I'll add something else. That's the focus over here. When you read the story, you have the petach. You have Lot saying to the people, they've come under my beam. Al-Kain Bo B'Tzel Korati. You have the delet. You have the opening of the door. You have the closing of the door. So what happens within Sodom, there's a space that's set off as separate from Sodom. Yes, Sodom will be destroyed. But this particular house is a safe haven. And to underscore the parallel to Mitzrayim, I would point out that in Mitzrayim, there were 10 plagues. There were 3 sets of 3, and then there's the 10th plague, in Makat B'Cholot. In the last plague, actually, the last of the plagues of the sets of 3, the 3, 3, and 3, the 9th plague is the plague of darkness, is Choshech. And the Torah says that for 3 days, no one could leave their house, right? And it will come ish mitachtav, v'chol b'nei Yisrael haya'ar b'moshvotam. But for all the Israelites, there was light. They had light. The distinction between light and dark, between darkness and light, is precisely the distinction. The land of Egypt, the Torah identifies with a makom chashuch, a dark place. And the idea of the light, the rays of light, that Israel has light, suggests the ultimate separation. The first time we see separation in the Bible, it's Vayavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech, the God of creation of chapter 1 of the Torah. The first distinction God makes, the first Havdalah, is bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech. So the idea of Egypt as being a dark place, which is very interesting in its own right, and the idea of light being identified with separation from Mitzrayim, redemption. In fact, thinking about the burning bush, even though the Torah did not use the word or in terms of the snare, but it does focus on what Moshe sees over and over again, what he sees and what God sees. So the idea of light then as being separate from the darkness, the points of light amidst the darkness. And that's what you have over here. So when Sodom, God will destroy Sodom, that may be parallel to the 10th plague and to Yam Suf. But before you get to the 10th plague, you have the 9th plague, which in the land of Mitzrayim is Choshech. And over here it's Hikuba Sanverim, Mikaton Viad Godol, Vayimul Limtso Hapetach. So the parallel to Sodom, Yetziat Mitzrayim, is very clear. I have not yet addressed the more important question, was given all this, what is the point? That's a very important question. What do we learn from this? What light, no pun intended, does it cast on our understanding of the 2 stories, and especially the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which I will get to in a few minutes. But prior to that, let me stop and take comments or questions at this point.
We've had a hand up for a while
Yes.
now. So
Go ahead.
Siva, would like to unmute.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir. You, Rabbi Silber, you were mentioning that Saddam was in many respects like Mitzrayim. And I just wanted to ask you if it's fair to compare Mitzrayim with Saddam. Mitzrayim was in several respects very kind, except that in the last 200 years, we see that Egyptians were oppressed as slaves, but not to this degree of cruelty, not to this degree of demonic cruelty. It was kind to Joseph, and Joseph was treated almost like a king. And in the end, Israelites were allowed to leave. And on many respects, this place, Saddam, looks like a place from the underground on the surface. It's not of the earth altogether. How is it fair to compare?
Okay, I'll respond to that point. Let me say the following. When I say the 2 are parallel in this particular text, and there are many parallels, obviously, it doesn't mean that they're identical. First of all, they're not identical even in terms of the punishment, because Mitzrayim is not destroyed. Pharaoh's armies may be destroyed. Sodom is utterly destroyed. Sodom is a ruin. Mapechat Sodom v'Amorah. So that's a very different. The God's response is different. Number 2, I would say that the points you're making let's accept them, that actually they're not identical, and I accept that. And in point of fact, by the way, I would add to what you're saying, that the Chumash in the book of Devarim, when it talks about what countries you should not connect to and can't be part of your people, it talks about Ammon and Moab. Don't accept the Ammonites and the Moabites, says the Torah, because they didn't greet you with bread and with water when you left Egypt. But when it comes to Mitzrayim, the Torah says, "Lo titaev Mitzri ki gera yita bi'artzo." Do not utterly reject the Egyptian. You were a stranger in his land. The Torah there says, as a third generation Mitzri, you are permitted to make part of your community. So obviously, the Torah distinguishes Mitzrayim from something like Sodom, and I never meant to suggest, farthest thing from my mind, that they're identical, and nor is the punishment identical. But I'm making a different point, that this particular text, because what you're talking about is in general. And my point is that the in general is the function of many different texts. And the texts, which, by the way, connect to each other and in light of each other are also read differently. One text can be read in different ways, because you read a text in light of what the text itself says, and then you may read it in light of what other texts say about it, which doesn't nullify the first reading. So you could have one text and several readings. So whereas what you're saying is correct, in my view, 100% correct, they're not identical, nor does the Chumash say they're identical. But this particular story over here presents the two as parallel stories and similar in many, many respects. That's not to say there aren't some distinctions. And furthermore, when you have parallel texts, there always are some distinctions. And on top of that, we have other texts. I mentioned the one in Devarim, which is black on white. Do not utterly reject the Egyptians. You were a stranger in the land. Here, chapter 23 of Devarim. And there are other texts. And in the prophetic writings about Mitzrayim, there are texts which talk about Mitzrayim being rebuilt and being reborn on top of that. So Mitzrayim is much more complicated. But this particular text, the Mitzrayim of Reshit and Shemot, and the Paro in these books is a bad guy. And what changes is not Paro. All the Paros are the same in Reshit and Shemot. Circumstance may change. When Paro needs you, Paro needs Joseph to figure out how he can assume complete control over Mitzrayim. He treats Joseph very nicely. And once he has control over Mitzrayim, Joseph has to beg the servants of Paro to get an audience. So it's, and the next guy forgets him utterly. So overall, Mitzrayim is a bad place, without question. But you're right, it's not Sodom. Anybody else with comment? Okay, if not, speak up if you have. Let me continue then with our chapter. Okay. Anyway, let me make another point about.
Yeah, just to interject briefly, just the way we started, and I tried to write it to you. It made me wonder about whether what the Chumash is doing is it's giving a detail about the result of the fall of human beings by eating from the tree of tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that's the use of their saying we want to know them. I
mean, that's an interesting question in terms of, in general, the knowing over here, and actually other texts as well, to what extent it goes back to that first larger question about what human beings know and don't know. It's a bigger question. I will say that, first of all, having eaten of the tree of knowledge, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, for better or worse, that's a question, or maybe for better and worse, the human being is capable of knowing, which for the Chumash certainly means, since you're capable of knowing, you are held responsible for things that you do, and the answer is, I don't know, is not a valid response. So for example, when it comes to Cain, right? What God said to Cain, listen, what are you so upset about that I accepted the other sacrifice and that you are? If you do good, say you'll either be forgiven or you'll rise to the top, you'll be chosen. But God doesn't spell out what it means to do good. God presumes that you know good from bad. So having eaten of the tree of knowledge, you're a person that has free will, which is why you can never return to the Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden is not for a place that have full knowledge. It's for people that have very limited knowledge. But once you have knowledge, you can never go back to God. That's why Sodom becomes Kigan Hashem Ki Eretz Mitzrayim. Because what you do doesn't really matter so much if you're in Egypt. It's Kula Mashke. If you have the Nile River, there's always water. But in the land of Canaan, the Torah says, God seeks it out. Sometimes there's rain, sometimes there's not rain, which in the Chumash is a function of human behavior. So the point is that knowledge, not knowledge, that is, you raised a very big question. I have spoken about it in the context of Megillat Esther of chapter 4, where the word knowledge in the chapter 4, when Esther agrees to go to the king, which is the climactic chapter of the book, there the word knowledge is a guiding word in the entire chapter, and I've spoken about that, but I can't get into that now. But you raise an interesting question, and there's something to it, and it's a very central question, given the fact that the tree of knowledge is where our human history really begins with the Eitz Hadat. Let me make a different point about these verses that I just read, namely chapter 19, verse number 9. The people of Sodom said, look at it. This guy comes to dwell here as a ger. He's a stranger. He's a judge. We're going to harm you more than them. And what's interesting is it reminds me of a different pasuk.
מי שמך לשר ושופט עלינו.
Exactly. When Moshe went out to see what's happening to his brethren, and he saw their struggles and their suffering, and he saw a Hebrew from his brethren smiting one of his brethren. Sees two Jews fighting. The word me'achav appears 3 times there. It's brethren. And Moshe says, Rasha, lama taka reyecha. Why would you hit your friend? It's your friend. You don't hit your friend. What is this? And he said to him, Misam ish sar v'shofet aleinu. Well, who made you who made you a prince? Who made you a judge? You would kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? So apparently Moshe had killed the Egyptian the previous day. So they know about it and they're talking about it. And Vayira Moshe vayomar acheno da davar. Surely the matter is known. And the next verse, Paro hears about it, either directly or indirectly from them. The Midrash, of course, perhaps a bit cynical, asked the question that in the previous day, Moshe said, turn this way and that way, and he saw nobody. And he killed the Egyptian who was beating the Jew. So the Midrash asked the question, so what do you mean? So how did they know when Moshe had done, when it says he looked this way and that way, and he saw nobody? There was no ish. You can answer many different ways, but the Midrash says, well, there's one guy who did know. He was the guy that the Egyptian was beating. So no good deed goes unpunished. So the Midrash has the guy who was being beaten up informing on Moshe. But leaving that aside, you have the same verse. That the point of those are the Jews talking, but the Jews are talking the language of Sodom, which is the language of Mitzrayim. So that's another interesting connection between the two. It's not just about Sodom. This is a very important point. Let me just digress for one moment about this last point, and actually about Medrash and about the Haggadah and about the Seder and about life too, which is all the same thing, which is, we think of the world as the good guys and the bad guys. Paro's the bad guy. Paro's the bad guy. The Jewish people, they're the good guys. But when you look at the Midrash, what the Midrash often points out is that 2 things. First of all, it's plenty to learn from the bad guys. And number 2, the bad guys aren't only out there. So that, for example, the Midrash, in that we have in the Haggadah, which cites the verse, and they point us to the story of King David taking a census. Takes the census in the book of Chronicles, without getting to the details now, but David taking the census, which in effect is saying, these are my people. They're my people, not God's people. I'm going to count them. They're my people. That's exactly a Pharaoh-like maneuver. What do you mean? What do you mean you want to go serve your God? You want to be Avdei Hashem. Shalach ami v'yavduni. Pharaoh says, but they're working for me. They can't work for two masters. Tichbara avodah, they work for me. That mentality of the people in control saying the other people are there to serve me, that's not limited to Pharaoh. That could be anybody, including King David. And that's the point of the Midrash, and that's something to learn from the story here, which is the language, Misam Cholish Sarvish Ofet Aleinu, is not just the language of Sodom, which is Mitzrayim, it's also our language. We can adopt exactly the same language. So that's another very important point. And that's why Moshe is not so anxious to go back there. Not just because they're the cause of his having to run away, because he says to himself, presumably, why should I bother saving them? I'm happy where I am. I have Midian. I have the priest of Midian. He seems like a wonderful human being. We believe in the same things. We believe in justice and caring for the oppressed and helping people out. We believe in mishpat. We believe in saving people. I'm happy here. Why would I go back to Mitzrayim? To which God says to Moshe, you got to save your brethren. Those are your brothers. Your brothers and your sisters. That's your task. And that's your mission in life. You don't have to like them, but you have to save them. And that's what Moshe does. He struggles, but he actually, at the end of the day, does it. But part of his reluctance to do it, no doubt, is his experience with the Jews in Egypt. That's Sodom talking, which we have adopted their language. That's another parallel between the stories. Okay, let us continue now. We're not going to finish this chapter this week, obviously, but let's go on. Fine. Vayamru anashim elot. Od miluchapo. So the people say to Lot. And here we come to a very, very interesting point about chapter 19. And I'll tell you a little story about it. Vayamru anashim elot. Od miluchapo. Who else do you have in Sodom? Chatan, ubanecha, ubnotecha, v'chol asher lecha bo'ir, hotzei min hamakom. Say, you have a Chatan, a son-in-law, banecha ubnotecha, sons and daughters. It sounds from this verse that Lot has sons. We've never heard of his sons, but it sounds like he actually has. Banecha means your sons. So it sounds like he has son-in-law, sons, daughters. We know he has at least 2 daughters. If he has sons-in-law, he presumably has more daughters. All that you possess, take out of this place. So say ben hamakom. We are destroying the city. They came to check it out. It just got checked out in spades. God has sent us to destroy it. Every word is wonderful here. Lot went out. He spoke to his sons-in-law, those that took his daughters. Lochei b'notav is superfluous. It says sons-in-law, they're obviously married to his daughters. But here, lochei b'notav carries with it a negative. It's negative in the context. The Torah speaks in the book of Devarim, ki kach ish isha, if a man take a woman. Ki kach ish isha is not necessarily a pejorative term in that context. But over here, chatanav lochei b'notav is pejorative in my view, given the context of the story. The people of Sodom are people, and Lot offers them his daughters. They want to take the strangers, they want to take Lot, and they want to take the daughters. They prefer the men to the women. They prefer the stranger to the women, I would say, is really the main point here. But in any event, so Chatanav Lochei b'notav suggests that they are Sodom-like, the sons-in-law. And when Lot says to them, get up and leave the city, for God is destroying the city. It seemed to them as somebody who's mocking or jesting. So they discount what he says altogether. Why would God do this? What do you have in mind or something? So they totally discount. When he says they spoke to his sons-in-law, that means he has more than one son-in-law. Chatanav is plural. So let's say he has at least 2 sons-in-law. If he has 2 sons-in-law, by the way, and he has sons, that's at least 2, and he has 2 unmarried daughters, and there's Lot and his wife. If you add up the numbers, my friends, you get to the number 10. There's Lot and his wife is 2, the 2 unmarried daughters is 4, the 2 sons is 6, and the 2 married daughters and 2 sons-in-law is 10. So actually it turns out that when Avram prayed for 10, actually, he stopped at 10. If Lot and the family were virtuous people, you would get your 10. You would have the 10 people over here. When it comes to this minyan, everybody counts the women for the minyan. So there were 10 righteous people in the town. That would have saved the town. But apparently, there is nobody. The sons-in-law have no interest. So when Lot is going to leave, he will leave only with himself, the 2 unmarried daughters, and the wife. Now we'll see what happens over here. As the sun was rising, as the dawn was coming, they hurried him, they rushed him. The angels rushing Lot, saying, hurry up, take your wife and take the 2 daughters that are nimsaot, that are found with you, because the others you can't get to. The sons-in-law, that family, forget about. They mocked him. They think he's joking. So just get out as fast as you can. The city soon will be destroyed, and you will die together with the city. What Avram had said to God, would you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Right? Tzadikim Rasha. And the angels say to him, you will die with the other people if you don't move now. And maybe because you're not so virtuous either, as we've seen. You are on one hand an Abraham-like figure through the hospitality, but the offering of the daughters to the mob is Sodom-like. So you're sort of betwixt and between. You can be saved, but you got to move now, because if you don't leave, you will be destroyed. And his response in verse number 16, Vayitma'ama, but Lot tarried, he delayed, Vayitma'ama. Vayachaziku anoshim biyado v'yadishto v'yad shtei benotav v'chemrat Hashem alav. So the angels grabbed onto his hand and his wife's hand and his 2 daughters. God's mercy, because of the word's mercy on him. Chemrat Hashem alav. So they saved him and his family that's with him. Vayotziu vayanichu michutz la'ir, and they took him out and they placed him outside the city. Here there's a very interesting point, and that's verse number 16, Vayitma'ama. He tarried or he delayed. Right? Verse number 16, Vayitma'ama. You see
Is
that
it shalshelet, Rabbi Silber?
it's a shalshelet on it, which perhaps suggests also hesitation. The shalshelet suggests hesitation. But there's something else about the word Vayitma'ama. Vayitma'meya appears in the Torah 3 times. It appears here. It appears later in the story of Yehuda speaking to his father in chapter 43. We can't get into that now. And it appears the 3rd time in the Torah. The Torah says that when we left the land of Egypt, says the Torah, we ate matzot, we ate matzah, we didn't eat chametz, we didn't eat leavened bread, we ate unleavened bread. Why? Ki garshu mi Mitzrayim. We were chased out of Egypt. We could not tarry. We had no provision provided for us. There you have the word hitmameya, and the Torah says we were kicked out. We were chased out of Egypt. The Egyptian people chased us out of Egypt, so we could not tarry. We were thrown out. And let's see if we can find that verse. That's a verse in, let me see if I can find the verse. Because the verse is interesting for another reason. Let's see if I can. Yes, there are 2 verses. This is chapter 12 of Shemot. Verse number 39. We could not tarry, we were chased out, and we had not provided any provision for ourselves. They baked unleavened cakes, matzah, ugot matzot. Earlier, that's verse number 39. And now you have chapter 12 of Shemot, verse number 13, which describes how the Jews depart from Egypt. Vatechazak Mitzrayim ala'am v'maher l'shalcham min haaretz ki amru kulanu meitim. The Egyptians, Vatechazak. Here the translation is urge, but it's more than urging. Chazak is strong. They overpowered them, one might say. They overpowered the people. l'maher v'shalcham min haaretz, to throw them out, for they said, we're all going to die. Is the plague of the firstborn. So what do we have? Why did we leave the land of Egypt? What does the Torah say in chapter 12 of Shemot, verse 33 and verse 39? Torah makes a very simple point. Yes, we did leave the land of Egypt. But the question the Torah asks is, if the Egyptian hadn't thrown us out, the Egyptian people, not Pharaoh, but the Egyptian people throw us out, but techazak, we could not tarry. But if we could have tarried, would we have left or not? It's an open question. And of course, it plays off precisely the verse in our chapter. Vayitma'ama, Lot did tarry. Vayachaziku anashim biyado, but they grabbed onto his hand. Vayachaziku, vatechazak Mitzrayim ala'am. Lo yochlu hitma'meya. Mitzrayim. But had we been able to tarry, who knows? Point of fact, what is the point? And here we come to the deeper point about the question we ask or should be asking is, you can ask me, what are you trying to say? What is the point of all this cleverness? Point is very simple. The Chumash is interested, it goes back to a comment that was made earlier. The Chumash is interested in so many different ways to describe the Israelite people that leave Mitzrayim. Who are they? We know we are saved. The Chumash says it explicitly. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the end of chapter 2. But what about this people that leave Mitzrayim? If we had to categorize them, how would we categorize the Israelites in the land of Egypt? And when you read chapter 19, there's one perspective in chapter 19. The people in the land of Egypt, if you want to understand them, who are they similar to? It's one little word, Lot. We are Lot. We are Lot in as much as we don't have the merit to be saved on our own. We're not fully righteous people. We're not wicked people either. Not at all. We have some faith to some extent. And the fact of the matter is that the people that leave Egypt didn't just walk out of Egypt. Like Lot, we had difficulty leaving Egypt. Why do we have difficulty leaving Egypt? Because there's a piece of us that is Egypt. There's a piece of us that says, Mi samcha ish savrish hofet oreinu. There's a piece of us that night and throughout the 40 years that says, let's go back to Mitzrayim. There's a piece of us that says, we'd rather have the security of slavery than the insecurity of freedom. There's a piece of us that says, remember the onions and the cucumbers and the watermelons that we got for nothing, chinam. And Rashi comments, chinam in our mitzvah. There was no obligations. They're forgetting about the abuse and the slavery and all that stuff. There's a piece of us that says, nitna rosh b'nashuva mitzrayma. And the point is, you can read this into the very Exodus itself. It's exactly Lot. And here we come to another significant parallel to Lot, which is that in the case of Lot, we have here in chapter 19, so when Lot, they place Lot outside the city, and they say to Lot in verse number 17, verse 17, Vayomer, Himoleit al nafshecha, al tabit acharecha, v'al tamod b'chol hakikar, ha'hara himoleit penti sofer. They put him outside the city. They put them outside the city, and they say to Lot, flee for your life, himoleit al nafshecha, right? And they're explicit where he should go. Ha'hara himoleit penti sofer, run to the mountain, run to the mountain. Himoleit, playing on the name Lot. They say to Lot, himoleit, ha'hara himoleit, right? And Lot's answer is, I can't. I'm grateful for what you did. Anochi, in verse number 19, Anochi lo uchal himoleit tahara. I can't go to the mountain. Pentid bakani hara vamati. Lest death cleave to me and I die. I can't go there. Let me go to a different place, which is nearby. Ir krova lanushama v'hi mitzara, a small city nearby. Imota nashama. Let me run there. Hello, Mitzari Utchi Nafshi. He goes to the small town. The small town is Soar. Soar is mentioned in chapter 14 as one of the five cities. So Ahara Himalate means leave the 5 cities and rush to the mountain. It means presumably go back to Abraham. And I say this for a good reason, because of the language of verse number 17. Ki hotziam otam hachutza. That's a loaded phrase. Hotziam otam hachutza. We encountered it in chapter 15. When Abraham said to God, I have no one to take over for me when I die. I have no succession. Vayotzei oto hachutza. And he took Abraham outside, hachutza, and said, count this, can you number the stars? Kol yezarecha. So you will have a successor, you will have a covenantal successor. And there's the promise of the land, which is chapter 15, succession and land, and that's vayotzei oto hachutza. So Lot is being brought hachutza, and as the Chumash does in other places, he's given an opportunity to go back, to return. It's not too late to return. You're not really part of Sodom. The problem is he is part of Sodom. The problem is he's caught betwixt and between. He can leave Sodom. He can be dragged out of Sodom. Okay, he tarried, he delayed, but he can't take the next step to take the next step to return to the land, the covenantal land. And that, my friends, is exactly the story of the Torah. The people that leave Mitzrayim, we get out of Mitzrayim. We're chased out, we're kicked out, we want to go out. We could not tarry, we might have tarried. But the next step that God said to Moshe at the burning bush, I will go down into Mitzrayim and I will bring them to that land, to a good and broad land, Eretz Tovah Ruchava, Eretz Avat Chalav U'Dvash, Haklani, Amori, etc. That land we never get to. That next step we cannot take. To go to the mountain. Remember when Moshe prayed to go into the land? Let me go into the land, says Moshe, Hahar Hatov Hazeh V'Halvanon, to the good mountain. God says, I'm sorry. You did what I want you to do. You can't go to the good mountain. Good mountain is the land of Canaan. So the point is, here Lot is being offered the opportunity and can't do it. I can't do it. I can go nearby. I can get to the border, but I can't cross over into it. And that is precisely the story of the Israelites, of the Jewish people, of the generation that leaves Mitzrayim. So the literary function, the answer to my question, what is the literary function of Lot over here? The literary function of Lot is twofold. Is the literary function of Lot within the immediate context of Abraham. He casts a light on Abraham, and maybe we'll pick up with more of that next time. But he also becomes a central character in terms of the story of the Exodus. That's what the Medrash means, Pesach Haya, gave the matzah. The matzah also eaten at night, actually. But Erev Tochu Matzot, it's very, very parallel. Matzah you eat at night, not in the day. But Erev Tochu Matzot, but it's not just the matzah, obviously. The matzah, Rashi's 2-word commentary is the segue to understanding the depth of the parallels and the comparison between the character of Lot and the story of the Exodus and the Israelites who leave Egypt. And I want just to repeat what I said earlier in response to a comment. This is one perspective, but the way the Bible works, it works with multiple perspectives. If you're talking about the truth with a capital T, it's probably a function of gathering all the perspectives, if that's possible. And from all the different perspectives, you get a fuller picture. But this particular perspective of a people in Egypt unworthy of redemption on their own. But yes, they do connect to Abraham in a certain way, and God remembers the covenant, and we have fulfilled the terms of the covenant. And God will redeem us, and we might have tarried, might not have tarried. We retain those connections to Mitzrayim even after we leave. And there's a struggle, and we do get out, but we can't take those next steps. That is quite parallel to the story of Lot. So let me stop here and take some comments. We have not exhausted this chapter. There's another whole perspective on chapter 19, which is very interesting. Yeah, I would put in a plug for my Haggadah, by the way. If you don't have it, many people have it, but the Haggadah, I talk about this. I mean, we do more in the classes than just what's written, but there's a chapter on Lot, which is interesting. But next week we'll pick up on this chapter again, because there's another perspective on this chapter, which is, I mean, what you see over here, apart from everything else, is the artistry of the Torah. I mean, it's almost limitless, really. And when you read it, it's after you hear this, I think it's obvious. But the point is, but to see it, that's not obvious. And there's another entire perspective on chapter 19, which is very interesting. Hope we can complete that next week. If there are comments or questions, please, either in the chat. Anybody wants to speak up now? And we'll continue next week with chapter 19.
V'yanichuhu, out of order, obviously references Noah.
So we will get to Noah next week. That's the other perspective on the story. That is exactly, we'll get to Noah, and it's very deep, actually. Parallels are very important. We'll get to Noah next time. Yeah.
Like Hagar, you mentioned before, Lot is given a chance to join the covenant and chooses not.
It's exactly parallel to what I said about Hagar. It's exactly right. There's an opportunity given. In each case, that's probably what the Torah is after. It's not that he's simply rejected. He's given an opportunity. He chooses not to do it. And that what disqualifies him at the end of the day is his choice. He made a choice not to go back to the mountain. By the way, just to comment, there's less death overtake me. Right? That's what he says. Pen tidbokani hara vamati. Tidbokani hara vamati. That phrase reminds us of a different pasuk, a different story. Not about Lot, but about Lot's descendants. He has a heroic descendant, says Lot. Her name is Ruth. And when Naomi says to Ruth, don't come back with me. Don't come back with me. It says, Orpah goes back. Ruth dovkaba, but Ruth cleaved unto her. And she says, listen, why do you stay with me? Why do you cleave to me? Go back like this other daughter-in-law. No. Asher tamuti amut b'shama. Where you go, I will go. And when you die, I will die. And of course, the book of Ruth is responding directly to what it says over here. Pentid bokani harav amati. I can't cleave though, right? Lest death cleave unto me. I can't make that leap. And what Ruth says is exactly the opposite. I cleave unto you. Yes. And maybe there's no future for me, for being a Moabite woman. It doesn't matter to me. When you die, I will die. So in order to the justification of Ruth and the acceptance of Ruth is, of course, the Talmud has a different issue. Moabite women, Moabite men, but the book of Ruth knows nothing of that at all. The book of Ruth has a different justification. What do you mean she's a Moabite? She's Abraham's daughter. We don't care what she is. She's Abraham's daughter. How can you not accept Ruth? She's Abraham in spades. That's the justification. Because the point is, if Lot is Abraham's foil, then the foil of Lot becomes Abraham. That's the point of it. Anyway, what else? If you have when do you want to say something? Speak up, please. I can't, you're muted.
I'd say of the thread of unleavened bread. That Lot, when faced with suddenly strangers in his house, he has to feed, does the fast thing. He doesn't have the time to let the bread rise, to go out and get a calf, kill it, and so forth. Because in the town of Sodom, you don't get that kind of time if strangers come in your house. So he gives them unleavened bread. And then we get into these issues of when he has to leave the town, he can't summon the strength that he had to produce the bread for the men in order to get himself out.
Right, I will talk next week about the matzah. We'll come back to the matzah next week. It's a very important point about the matzah. Obviously, it's very important, very central. And of course, the matzah is central, obviously, in the story of Pesach, right? So we will talk about, we'll get back to the matzah next week. We haven't exhausted, there's plenty more in this chapter. Will take us a whole session. And it's actually very relevant since Pesach's coming up soon. It's, so it's also preparation for Pesach. If anybody has
unlike the Pesach story, unlike the Pesach story is Lot's story, because in the Pesach story, God has already learned that you don't take them out unless they're willing to make the gesture of making the Korban Pesach first.
Right. So the point is that in the story over here, actually, and that's an important distinction. We'll talk about this next week. The story over here, the house as being a saving place, it's not that Lot generates that. It's that the outsiders, the angels, by say God's representatives, generate the place. Whereas in the Korban Pesach, we are commanded to take the sacrifice. We are commanded to take it beforehand, to prepare it, etc., etc. That is, we are commanded to put the blood on the doorpost. So there's the initiative of the people, which is a prerequisite to leaving, that you don't have in the story of Lot. And that is an important distinction between the two. We'll have to continue next week with this.
We have tons of classes happening this week, so we'd be happy to see you. If you need to catch up on this class, you can find the recordings at drisha.org/live.